Not everyone has the same goals in life, but for many people, earning enough money to buy a flashy, expensive car appears high on their wish list. If you were ever able to achieve that goal, we'd like to think you'd take good care of your expensive asset, and you certainly wouldn't abandon it for years to rot away in a field or inside a forgotten barn. Not everybody thinks like that, though. Because of that, we've been able to put together this whole video of expensive abandoned cars. This 1972 Lamborghini Uraco P250 is covered in dust and debris. But aside from that, it doesn't look too shabby, considering it's been hiding from the light for decades. It turned up in King's Lynn, Norfolk, England in March 2016 and was instantly pulled out of hiding and sent for auction. The Uraco was an unusual Lamborghini in that it had a V8 engine as opposed to a V12 and came with a back seat. That disqualifies it from supercar status, but hey, it's still a Lambo. The reasons that the car's owner chose to park the car in the barn and walk away are unknown. Perhaps they couldn't afford to keep their expensive car running, or maybe there was a mechanical fault. Either way, this was a good opportunity to acquire a vintage Lamborghini at a knockdown price. And we hope whoever picked it up at auction had got it back on the road and looking its best. We know what you're thinking. That last Lamborghini only got left in the barn because it's a less respected model. Surely nobody would do that to a top-of-the-range Lambo. Oh yes, they would. Here's a 25th anniversary edition 1989 Lamborghini Kuntak that met with exactly the same fate in Buffalo, New York, USA in 2018. At the time it was identified and recovered, it had barely over 4,000 miles on the clock. This beautiful car has barely moved at all since the day it was lovingly put together. It seems that spending so many years in storage didn't dampen the market's enthusiasm for the vehicle. When it sold at auction, it went for more than $300,000. On closer inspection of the car, we think that might have been a touch too low. All the original parts are still present and correct. The V12 engine still purrs, and it comes with power steering and power windows, both of which shouldn't be taken for granted on a 1980s sports car. As for how it ended up in a barn for nearly 30 years, we can only guess. Maybe the owner forgot they had it. A car doesn't have to be fast or sporty to be valuable, but the name of the manufacturer does tend to count. Our third forgotten car in this video is also a Lamborghini, but not the kind of Lamborghini you're probably thinking of. It's a 1964 Lamborghini 2R tractor. Like Porsche, Lamborghini made farm vehicles before they started making road vehicles, and it was sales of the uglier farm equipment that allowed the companies to finance their more eye-catching endeavors. That being said, even the farm equipment can be worth something so long as it's the right model. This one, which turned up as a barn find in March 2018, was listed for sale at $53,000 when it went to auction. The tractor was found at an undisclosed location in Washington state, which is a bit of a mystery as it's clearly an Italian import and still has its original Italian license plates attached. Aside from the familiar Lamborghini logo, the tiny details that make this stand out as the product of a great manufacturer are the 3-spoke steering wheel and the slightly elevated center gauge. It's a niche item, but it might be priceless to the right buyer. The majority of the cars you're going to see in this video have become abandoned due to accident or misfortune. But our next tale is one of shocking and deliberate abandonment on a massive scale. It's the story of German ex-racing driver Michael Froelich, who bought and paid for more than 50 vintage cars, then left them to fall to pieces in a forest. It's thought that his whole collection is worth more than $1 million. Leaving them under the trees wasn't enough for Michael. In some cases, he deliberately crashed the cars, half buried them, or left them perilously parked on the edge of a cliff. He's clearly not sentimental because one of them is a Jaguar Xk-120 he drove to victory in the Neanderthal German Grand Prix of 1984. There's also a Buick, a Porsche 356 racing car, and a classic British Rolls-Royce among the collection. Michael has deliberately collected one vintage car for every year of his life and views his collection as a form of personal artistic expression. We're sure that not everybody agrees. The Jaguar Xk-120 that Michael has in his forest might not look great, but we think this one might look even worse. If you were being generous, you might call it a restoration project. If you were perhaps a little more honest, you might call it a wreck. Cars like this are rare. They were built in 1948 onward as a limited run of only 12,055. This means that they have an inherent value even if they're in poor condition. So even this one, which was made in 1954, should sell for 5 figures. Getting it on the road again wouldn't be easy though. It hasn't moved for over 30 years, and the engine inside it doesn't appear to be the original. The owner of the car, who says that it was a restoration project he never got around to starting, says buying cars like this is more reliable as an investment than shares, bonds, or stocks. We're not financial advisors, so we're not going to touch the idea with a barge pole. But we can't help but wonder whether the cost of totally repairing this old Jag might exceed its sale value by the time you're done. Like his criminal father, Saddam, Uday Hussein had a taste for the finer things in life, and that went for cars as well as properties and boats. When he died, his collection of priceless cars was divided up and went missing in suspicious circumstances. Some of them have been tracked down, though, and that includes this spectacular Ferrari F40. Getting these pictures of it was a dangerous process for the intrepid photographer who acquired them. He tracked the car down to a network of Iraqi gangsters and had to pose as an interested buyer in order to get near it. From the story told to him by the gangsters, the car spent some time in Turkey to hide it from looters and authorities in the aftermath of Hussein's death, but was brought back a few years later after things cooled off. It appears to have been through some refurbishments that may have affected its value, but that doesn't matter to the gangsters. When the photographer asked for a price, they quoted him $1 million. Needless to say, he made his excuses and got out of there as quickly as possible. Sadly, he couldn't take the Ferrari with him. The BMW 507 is a nice car, but it's not a supercar. You wouldn't usually go out of your way to look at one, so what makes this one so unique? The answer to that question is all to do with its former owner. Once upon a time, this was Elvis Presley's BMW, and he drove it almost every day. Elvis was with the U.S. Army in Germany when he saw the 507 at the Frankfurt Motor Show in 1957 and fell in love with it. He bought it immediately, but quickly had it resprayed to red from its original white because teenage girls kept writing messages on the car's bodywork and lipstick. The vehicle left Germany with Elvis, but he eventually tired of it and sold it to racing driver Tommy Charles. Charles virtually drove the wheels off it, then sold it as a restoration project. But the restoration project never got started. It spent the years between 1964 and 2014 in a lockup before being rescued, and now has finally been restored to its original condition. To the right Elvis fan, it could be worth millions of dollars. Sometimes people abandon cars through choice, and other times the choice is forced upon them. Find yourself on the wrong side of the law, and any of your valuable possessions, say for example your beautiful Audi R8, might be seized and impounded until your legal issues have been resolved. Sometimes, of course, they never get settled, and that's why this R8 is in such heartbreakingly poor condition. The car is in lockup outside a police station in Mumbai, India. Allegedly, the Audi's owner was caught running an illegal call center scam and had to forfeit all the proceeds of his ill-gotten gains. We don't know what happened with this trial, but the local photographer who obtained these images says the R8 has been in the lockup for a full year and was also flooded along with the rest of the cars there during a freak storm. That makes it likely that the car's interior is as badly beaten up as its exterior. Based on its number plate, the car was once owned by Indian cricket captain Virat Kohli, although he says he sold it long before it ended up in criminal hands. Let's go back in time to the year 1970 when the 24-hour race of Le Mans was still considered the pinnacle of motorsport. The biggest battle on the track was between Porsche and Ford, who would have done anything to gain an advantage over each other, but there were other cars and different manufacturers involved. In another universe, Lamborghini might have risen to dominance thanks to a truly unique concept car designed by Luigi Calani. He was a fashion designer first and foremost, specializing in furniture before branching out into designing trucks for Daimler and Uraco. Nobody asked him to reimagine the Lamborghini Miura as a Le Mans racing vehicle, but he did it anyway. By the time he was done, it was unrecognizable. He'd cut most of the car away and replaced it with a new fiberglass cockpit controlled with a joystick. The car's front wheels don't turn. The entire front of the car does instead. It never took to the track, but was used as a show car for 4 years before vanishing from the world. It wasn't until 2010 that it reappeared, but by now it was a battered wreck. We're not even sure it's possible to restore this broken shell without Kalani's assistance, but we'd love to see someone try. Gambling can be a fun activity if you know your limits, but if you don't, bad things can happen. It was a bad gambling decision that put this beautiful 1925 Type 22 Bugatti Brescia car underwater in Italy and ruined it forever. The car belonged to René Dreyfus, a famous racing driver from France. René was a gifted driver and won the world-renowned Monaco Grand Prix in 1930, but he also enjoyed nights out and high-stakes gambling. He came up against his perfect match in millionaire Swiss playboy Adalbert Bodie one night in Paris. The two engaged in a game of poker, and René bet his beloved Bugatti that his hand was worth more than the playboy's. He was wrong. Dreyfus went home with his tail between his legs, and Adalbert tried to drive back to Switzerland in his new car. Unfortunately for him, René hadn't given him any documentation, so Adalbert was told by customs officials at the border that he couldn't bring the car with him. In his petulance, he dumped the car in Lake Maggiore rather than allow the border officials to impound it. It didn't come out of the lake again until 2009, by which time it was little more than a skeleton. It's now on display at Mullins Car Museum in California, USA. Seeing a ZIS 110 standing in the open is a very rare thing indeed. These Soviet limousines came from the 1940s. Only 2,000 of them were ever built, with production ceasing in 1958. Of those 2,000, the overwhelming majority were either handed directly to high-ranking Soviet politicians and officers, or gifted to foreign dignitaries. That means that very few of them ever ended up in the hands of private citizens. With all of that taken into account, we have no idea how the shabby shell of a ZIS 110 ended up on the streets of Keza, Bulgaria. We don't know how long it was standing there before it was noticed, but based on the flat tires, the extreme rust, and the distorted panels of the body, we're guessing it's been several years. We're told that someone who knows a thing or two about these limousines took a closer look at it and discovered that the original engine had been removed and replaced with a D3900 diesel from the 1980s. This vehicle might well have been a state car in the past, but these days, it's just a state. A bad oil leak will take your car off the road for a while. There's no doubt about that. It shouldn't keep it off the road for 40 years, though. That tragic fate befell this beautiful 1965 Porsche 911, which comes from the very end of the vehicle's production run. The car's owner was a young man when he bought it in 1973 after promising himself that he'd buy a Porsche if he graduated from law school. He loved it dearly, but after 2 years an oil leak occurred and he was unable to repair it himself. He parked it up at home and made a mental note to contact a qualified mechanic, but never did. Because of that, the car stayed parked in the garage at his parents' house from 1975 until 2016. Finally, after 4 decades, he accepted that he was never going to drive the car again and offered it for sale. Porsche somehow became aware of the sale and decided to buy the car back for their Porsche Classic Center in the Netherlands. They're going to totally restore it to factory condition, after which it'll probably make an appearance at classic car shows. This is an abandonment story with a happy ending. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.